Hi, Fran. Well, this is exceedingly humbling to me to be here in front of my teachers, Chuck and Peter, and to not be a poet, but to be a reader of poetry. And I came to Fresno State in 1965 as a math major and was required to take an English course, and met my first wife, who's still my wife, she's right here, who said, you ought to take this teacher, Philip Levine. So I enrolled in a poetry workshop, and I didn't know anything about poetry. And I remember the first class session, he asked about a dozen of us there who were our favorite living poets. And I was terrified because I didn't know any living and hardly any dead poets. And so I said the only name that came to mind who was popular at the time, and I said Rod McEwen. I knew this audience would appreciate that. Well, Phil didn't. He looked at me politely but sternly and said, I said poet. And so I said the only other name that came to mind, which was Walt Whitman. So I said, Walt Whitman. And he said, I said living. So that was the beginning of my poetry education, and I thought when I left that first session that math was my future. But as it turned out, I became an English major and began to write poetry, but left going to law school, where I just completed a career in teaching law. The great wonder of this invitation was it led me to dig up the letters that I had received, not quite hundreds, as Clover mentioned, but scores, maybe 150 letters over the many years that I corresponded with Phil. And I decided, rather than bore you with some of my reflections, capture him a bit by sharing with you some brief segments of a number of letters, most of them from the late 60s, that I hadn't seen since they were received by me. These are 50-year-old letters. And the ones I want to start with, a few snippets, are remarkable because after I took a class or two, he took off to Spain with Franny and family, and I didn't know what I was going to do because I was sort of interested in poetry, and here he is, he left me. So I said, could I send you some poems? He said, sure. So here are a couple of, from 3 or 4, I'll just read them straight through, different letters. I won't tell you what he said about these poems, which are not, my mother would be embarrassed. Even though she's no longer alive, she'd be embarrassed. If you got an okay on one of his poems, or an okay plus, it was orgasmic. It was fabulous. Okay, here's Phil, a letter from Phil. You're a winner, Kader. You didn't waste a moment getting those poems off. You can't imagine how many people have asked me to read their work, and then when I said yeah, they never sent it. Perhaps it's a throwback to childhood, when one asked a question and expected to be denied. Let me talk about this poem right off, the poems right off. I'll probably be a little rougher on these poems than I would be if I saw them in class, where they would be surrounded by a lot of simpering, stupid cousins, or conventional old aunts wearing flowered hats. Another letter. These two poems, this is sometime later, but still while he was in Spain. These two poems are the best I've seen by you. You've taken a great leap forward. You should be pleased as hell, man, but now you're going to law school, and you're suddenly becoming a true poet. Hanselcheck, he must be an awfully good teacher, but I have no doubt your stuff has taken a leap forward. A couple of years later, when I did go to law school at the University of Washington, I wanted to come see Phil, but was embarrassed. And so I wrote him I don't know what I wrote him. I can only imagine given his responses. But here's one from probably 69 or 70. When he began to type letters, he would put, for me, the entire date, the year, but these early letters had month and day, but not the year. I'm sorry you didn't come by. I think it's natural that you should make a pilgrimage to an old teacher, poetry master. We all want to believe that these to be worshiped people really do exist. It makes life more significant, more hopeful. Maybe they do exist, but I ain't one of them. I'm a damn good poet, a damn good teacher, but I haven't got life up my sleeve. Shit, life has got me down its leg. Half the time I'm hanging on by my thumbs. I only know more than you because I'm twice your age and have been an adult 5 times as long. But I may have forgotten the only things that really matter. I may be 10 times as far from the source of my strength, my soul, my poetry. So no more pilgrimages to my house. I used to address all my letters to him as Professor Levine. So he wrote back again in the early 70s. This one I don't think is from Spain, but I'm not certain. Listen, David, why don't you call me Phil? I know I'm old enough to be your Zadie, but then you should have called him Phil too. Everyone calls me by my first name. I don't even have a PhD. If you don't start calling me Phil, I'm going to call you Captain Kader. That advice, when I taught recently at Seattle University, a summer course, students asked what they should call me. And I said, you can call me either Phil or Captain Kader. And most of the students called me Captain Kader. Here's a couple of reflections in letters he wrote me about teaching. Amigo, we go back to teaching, and this is a letter dated August 25th, so summer's over. Amigo, we go back to teaching in about a week. No, capital N-O, I'm not pleased by this prospect. I've been teaching on and off largely since 1955, and it's very hard to remain enthusiastic. I think it would do me good to be a municipal judge, maybe for a few years, and let one of those guys teach poetry. We'd both learn something anyway. January, following that August, I had fabulous students, he wrote me, one of the best groups of beginning poets ever, all sorts of people of all ages. The champs, and maybe some of you will recognize yourself here, the champs were a young Chicano, a 45-year-old housewife from Fig Garden, a huge bearded Okie painter, about 28, and a sweet little sophomore girl. Great variety of people, blacks, Chinese, a Protestant minister, a few heads. I think I know what that means. And several of them even worked like mad. It was a marvelous class. It was hard to bid farewell. The following year, I think maybe 71, it sounds as though you're really going to be a lawyer. Why not? I say to myself, I wish I'd become a lawyer instead of a teacher, but then I say that only because a new semester is dawning. And I'm not delighted to be back at work. Or maybe it's just to be back at Fresno State where all is overcast with gloom. I think it's the same story everywhere. The fascists coming down hard. And as a teacher, you feel so powerless, and you don't exactly feel like a Superman as a poet either. But one has got to fight through the hard times and the defeats, or one isn't worthy of whatever small victories come in a lifetime. Let me conclude with some more recent. One is from 1992 and one is from 2005. Allen Ginsberg had recently died, a few other poets. So I wrote him about, I had just been to Europe and there were all these sites of pilgrimage for famous writers and poets. Didn't seem to be in the States, so I must have written him about that because he says, no, I don't think there would ever be a shrine to an American poet, certainly not one visited by any. People do go to Whitman's place in Camden, but his house on Long Island was torn down. And as Larry Levis writes, they put up a Walt Whitman Mall in its place. I'm going to go visit that sometime. The last passage from a letter, if I can get through it. My father had died, and I guess I had written him a letter about grieving, and he wrote back as follows. I think once we get to a certain age, our lives can tip in the direction of grief, and there's nothing we can do about it. I personally pray to outlive my children and their children, but then I'm asking them to deal with my death. I know I couldn't deal with theirs. But I try not to complain in my heart, nor should you, for life is pretty damn good, and we know it.